Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Convo Couch. I'm Fiorella Isabel, and I have an amazing guest with me today. And I want you to help me say your name because I know I'm going to butcher it. Kevork Almassian.
Yes, exactly. You pronounce it right.
Okay, good. I've been wanting to have you on because there are a lot of things the independent media, particularly the West, gets wrong about Syria. Even people who consider themselves anti-imperialist and who attempt to do a decent job at breaking down foreign policy, I see these blind spots when it comes to how they view politicians or how they view the politics of another country. Because even recently going into covering the elections in Peru, I saw how the West would try to fit another country's politics into the way America views, everything through the lens of right, left, Democrat, Republican, when things are a lot more complex. So thank you for coming on.
It's a pleasure to be on your show.
So you've been vocal about how terribly some of the West, like I said, even independent media has covered Syria and West Asia. What do you see as the main issue in their coverage and why?
Actually, there are multiple problems in the coverage. First of all, let's put the mainstream media aside because it's not a coverage. It's a pure propaganda when it comes to Syria. But when we talk about the independent, especially anti-imperialist left-wing media outlets in the West, there are a few problems. First of all, a lot of people in the independent media are more or less careerists, and they want to make a career on YouTube or on Twitter. Therefore, they try to sound like an objective, okay? So in order to surf in these waters of the social media, they repeat the talking points of a lot of mainstream media in order to look like they are professional. However, unfortunately, some of these people also visited Syria and they received a journalistic visa, and they have seen with their own eyes that with the journalistic visa, they were cruising in the cities without any minders or someone following them or telling them what to cover and what not. And let's remember, Syria is still in a war situation. And despite that, they had a lot of freedom in their coverage and what to say and what not to say, despite the fact that some of them were also calling Syria like a brutal dictatorship, a police state, and in the past few years. But despite that, they received the visa because Syria is interested in getting in journalists, and Syria is interested not only in alternative media journalists, but also mainstream media journalists. And until this moment, the BBC has a correspondent in Damascus and other mainstream media outlets. The thing is, how to put the Syrian conflict into proper context. So some people say it's a civil war, which is completely wrong. Others say it's a proxy war, which is relatively true. It's basically a regime change war waged by the United States and its allies in the region, okay? Now, it has miserably failed from a geopolitical perspective, but socially, there are certain things that should be handled. But let's talk about the context. So when we talk about the issue in Syria as an imperialist war, okay, that means the forces that are fighting underground, who have received funding up to billions. We are talking about only Britain has spent around £500 million in Syria. Qatar has spent hundreds of millions of dollars. It's with billions, right? Israel, Saudi Arabia, all these rich countries, they have spent billions of dollars in Syria. Of course, they didn't spend this to bring democracy, right? They wanted to change the regime in Syria. Therefore, when any particular group in Syria, whether it's a political group or it's an armed group that opposes Assad and they're receiving this funding, they are losing the title of being an opposition, because they have become a tool in the hands of the United States and its allies in the region, including Israel, which is very important for Syria because Israel still occupies the Golan Heights. So when the government reacts against such groups, whether they are political or mostly are armed, and because of this funding, because of this support, and because the government knows that what's coming next because of these groups, this should be considered a war against the tools of the imperialists in Syria and not fighting its own people, despite the fact that some people who are fighting the government, they carry the Syrian passport. But that doesn't deny the fact that they are tools for the imperialists in Syria. So when you say, yes, it's an imperialist war, but Assad is killing his own people, you're already contradicting yourself. It's either an imperialist war on Syria, or it's either Assad is killing his own people. So it doesn't make sense to say it's an imperialist war, well knowing that these groups are tools for the imperialists, and at the same time you say it's killing his own people. The people who are fighting the government nowadays, yes, they were born in Syria, they have a Syrian passport, but if you read Arabic and you understand what they say in videos, and they are very vocal about this. They say it on YouTube, they say it on their social media accounts. They don't consider themselves Syrians. They feel like more Turks, like they consider Erdogan to be their ruler, because their identity, they have adopted an Islamist identity that Erdogan is spreading in the region. Therefore, their loyalty is no more to their macro identity, which is Syria, but rather to the Islamist identity, which is to Erdogan. So if anyone covering Syria doesn't understand these small differences, it will be like, I'm very sorry to say, but he will look very ignorant when he is addressing the issue from an imperialist point of view, and at the same time it's saying that, for example, it's the brutal dictatorship and Assad is killing his own people.
Right. I think there's a lack of understanding from the West, because they're not the occupied country, they're not the oppressed country, so they can say a statement that's contradictory, like Assad is a brutal dictator, but also I support Syrians, because they think that both can exist, even though that's not how it works. We, in America, we have politicians that are extremely corrupt, and Americans say, well, I don't support those politicians, I support something else. It doesn't always work like that in other places. And long debunks have been you would think have been the attacks in Duma, the Syrian chemical attacks that Assad gassed his own people. And most independent media has caught up. I mean, you'll still see like the TYT people, talk about the white helmets in a positive way. You'll still see that, but it's slimmer and slimmer and less, which is a good thing. But who are the journalists that you look to expose that? Because that's been exposed for a while, and like I said, finally people are catching up and talking about it openly, but that's been exposed for a while. And I know I've had Vanessa Beeley on the show, I've had Eva Bartlett. Who are other journalists that you think have been exposing the truth about Syria?
First of all, TYT is not an independent media. TYT
not at all. Yep.
It has a clear line, and they are infiltrating the anti-imperialist left-wing camp in the United States. They are infiltrators, and they are really dividing the left into an imperialist left and anti-imperialist left. It's like really funny when I watch their coverage, especially when it comes to Syria, and the level of ignorance is unreal. Like when I watch it, I feel like, how come these people call themselves journalists, right? But when you wanna like debunk these lies regarding Syria, first of all, go to Syria and ask the people on the ground. For example, when independent journalists such as Eva and Vanessa were in Aleppo, and they were on the humanitarian corridors when the Syrian army opened humanitarian corridors for the civilians to flee the eastern neighborhoods in late 2016. And everyone coming out and they were like interviewing people. Have you seen the white helmets? Do you know the white helmets? And people like, who are the white helmets? The people never heard of the white helmets. The white helmets is it's a British intelligence agency constructed organization. And their main mission is to, it's like a Hollywood team. They have a very sophisticated equipment, and they're just showing us the aftermath of events. They don't show the event they don't put it into proper context. They only show what happened after the event, and they add some voiceovers or music over it, and people will be affected, right? We are all emotional people at the end of the day, and it's very easy to manipulate the emotions of the people, and they are really good at it. And this doesn't come like this. It's all about training and funding and all this montage. That's there is after processing happening, right? And it's so fast. Like in Aleppo, there was no internet. Like the electricity was cut and there was a blackout, and it was a war zone. And these white helmets guys, they have the fastest internet. I don't know if it's connected to the satellite, and they're just sending materials, right? So the first thing to do to understand this, ask the people. And please, no one tells me that you can't get a visa. Tourists can get a visa and journalists can get a visa. Only lazy people can't get a visa to Syria. And those who claim, and even people, I know people who are now, they changed their position a little bit regarding Syria. They were calling Assad like he's no different than ISIS and that he's a butcher and everything. And despite that, when they applied for a visa, they received the visa. So all this talk about that there is a dictatorship that doesn't grant a visa, it's an utter BS. So they can go there. And underground, like in my humble opinion, what Eva and Vanessa did, they really blew up the balloons of the lies of the mainstream media. And that is why they are smeared till today. And that is why they're called radicals, but they're not. They're really telling what happened there, and they're not being careerist. If they want to be careerist, they can repeat some of these CIA talking points and gain some jobs. Even and I want to mention this because for myself, I'm also considered a radical person according to who. And we can't receive any jobs, we can't get any positions in media outlets, even if this media outlets, it has a line that is close to our line, right? So they prefer people who are more or less hypocrite, and they manipulate with their terms in order that they look objective on the surface, but they're not objective at all. And I'm really sad to see this because first of all, I'm not talking as a journalist now, I'm talking as a Syrian. It really hurts me to see people go to Syria and see the truth with their own eyes. And when they go out of Syria and they were like, yes, it's a horrible situation. It's a regime change war and the people are suffering. We need to lift the sanctions, but it's a brutal dictatorship. You are really spitting in our faces when you come to Syria and you see everything with your own eyes, and then you go out and tell something like that. Syria is an open society. It needs a lot of political reforms, but if you go to Syria and see the lifestyle there, it's the 170 degree the opposite of a dictatorship. The dictatorship or a police state, it follows every aspect of people's daily life. And the security apparatus intervenes in people's lives and tells them what is okay and what is not. And I want to mention this because it's important for also the left-wingers in the United States. Even the LGBT community in Syria, which is very small, they're protected by the government because Syria is an overwhelmingly a Muslim community. And in Islam, the lesbian and gay homosexuality is banned. So in law, it is banned, okay? But in practice, it's very tolerated. And the government, there is even a bar in Damascus for homosexuals to go. So in a police state or in a dictatorship, you won't find this like tolerance towards the minorities, towards the multiculturalism in Syria, and towards the different, let's say, sexual orientations of the people. So as long as, I'm not being like, I'm not exaggerating now, okay? As long as the homosexual people in Syria do not engage, let's say, in sexual activities in the streets, there is nothing going to happen to them. And there are places that they can go and drink and do everything. And then, like, this is Syria, and people don't believe that. I remember Damascus in 2010, just a year before the war erupted. People like French kissing each other in Damascus, and people could be amazed by this. But this is what Syria was before the war. And the war was imposed on us, and they wanted to change the nature of Syria. This is the real issue that we need to understand. Syria was an open society, and they wanted to take it back in ages, and they succeeded partially. And nowadays, the government in Syria, because the bigger bloc of the opposition in Syria, they are Islamists. So, and you can't fight everyone, right? So they are even trying to make compromises with the Islamists and making the government less of an open, like more conservative and less liberal. Let's say, if that makes any sense, just to make peace with them, right? So we Syrians who were enjoying that lifestyle in Syria, we are the most people who were damaged and paid a big price for this.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you have to take the context of everything happening. And like you mentioned, you know, even people who consider themselves anti-imperialist, they still give these CIA talking points. Example, defending Palestine while condemning Hamas as a terrorist group. You know, saying, okay, the chemical attacks were not real, but Assad is a brutal dictator. This obviously, as you said, manufactures consent for Western involvement. But in particular regarding Assad, what is your opinion on him as a leader and on the support of the people towards him?
So let's be real. There are people who like Assad in Syria, and they are over 60-70%. Okay, this is not a scientific, let's say, statistics, but in my observation in the past 10 years, this is my conviction. And there are people who hate him to the bone, and they want to replace him, regardless of the motives. I opened my eyes to politics in 2003 when the US invaded Iraq, okay? And despite that, in Syria, we didn't have good relations with Saddam Hussein, but I was a kid and I cried when Iraq was invaded and destroyed. It was a beautiful civilization that was destroyed, right? And since then, I follow the foreign policy of Syria, and I'm very big fan of the foreign policy of Syria, which was against the occupation and invasion of Iraq, despite the differences between two Ba'ath parties, Syrian Ba'ath Party and the Iraqi Ba'ath Party. And later, the Syrian policy towards Lebanon, when Israel tried to occupy southern Lebanon, and how Syria opened all its stockpiles to the Lebanese resistance to kick out the Israeli occupation. In 2008, Syrian Cornet missiles, rockets, reached to Gaza through the Lebanese and the Iranian militants who took it from the Syrian stockpiles. And then when the war started in 2011, I was quite sure, because of all this past history of Assad, they wanted to harm him. Like he was really like a stick in the throat of the Uncle Sam, right? They can't swallow him anymore. So I also lived during this area a big technological advancement in Syria, a big educational advancement. I'm one of the people who was lucky enough to study in a very good university in Syria, and studied half in English and half in Arabic. And I learned English in Syria. And I consider myself educated enough to be in any university in the West, where the academia is in a much higher level, as it's claimed, right? Because I also studied in France. So if you were a person who wants to study or work, Syria was a very free market for education and for work. Like my father, who's he never had any certificate in his life, but he was a very successful businessman, and he started from zero. Mm-hmm. So there was an opportunity in Syria. It was a very cheap country. I remember that my monthly salary was $160 in Syria. And it was more than enough to do a lot of things, and even go to bars and go to clubs. And I'm telling you little details in Syria, right? So I was a fan of Assad, of course, because he gave us these opportunities, and he was open-minded with his people. But because of the track of the liberalization of Syria, or the opening the society and injecting more liberal values in it, was too fast. Some of the conservative communities in Syria weren't happy at all. Like I recall, or I remember, he gave a okay for opening a casino in Damascus, and the entire conservative and Islamist community were really angry, and they lobbied day and night until they closed that casino again. So it was like he's trying to advance the country, but at the same time there are regressive forces in the country. But he has to balance because he's the president. He can't be part of. He says, "No, I'm against you." No, he tried to balance everything. But the 2011 was horrible, and all this, the funding that came to Syria and the protesters that started from the mosques, and from the day one, I was 22 years old, and from the first day when even our smartphones were not really smart, like they were like the quality of the videos were really bad. But still back then I was documenting all the videos. I was downloading them from YouTube in my archives because I know that later we will need these videos and we will need to show the world that this has never started peacefully. If you go to any article now in the mainstream, just choose anyone, they will say they were like peaceful protesters and Assad came and started to shoot against peaceful protesters. And from the first day, the security people were dying with knives, like they were slaughtering them and hanging their heads over the places. Like we have all this documented. It's undeniable. So as a person that I call myself a moderate secularist person who is Syrian of Armenian origins, I would never be on the side of these head-chopping people. Of course, I will be with Assad, even though I would urge him to do more political reforms in Syria, but that doesn't mean that I would go against him and destroy the entire country for the sake of the alleged democracy. And I'm sorry, but who said that democracy could work in Syria? Who said that what works in the United States supposedly would work in Syria? Democracy is a process. It's a human development. It's a civilization development. We have a different history and we have different culture. We have different civilization. How come I would impose a democratic system on a country where, let's say, 20 or 30% or part of the society doesn't believe that his wife has the right to work, or his sister can go to university, or his sister cannot have a boyfriend? How can you, like, so you need to change first the grassroots of the society, like from the bottom of the hierarchy, and then go to the upper side of the hierarchy. But when you remove the head of this hierarchy and put in democratic system where the grassroots is not democratized yet, it will be an utter failure. And I think this is what America is trying to do in Syria.
Yes.
They don't want Syria to develop its own democracy. They're trying to impose a certain so-called democracy in Syria that would never work. So people say, I'm an anti-democratic, I'm a fascist, I'm just because I'm saying this basic truth. But the people, they're not pundits, they're not experts. There is no expert on Syria in the past 10 years. They call themselves experts, but they don't understand these simple details in Syria.
Yeah, that's very similar to how America, one of the reasons why the left in America is so weak, why there's no progression, because they try to impose more symbolic changes regarding social justice issues, trying to change people's ideology rather than changing the economic conditions. So they, in some ways, they put the cart before the horse, and they try to impose their ideological belief on everybody. And if people don't fit that, then there's something wrong with them, and
Yes.
it should be the other way around. And they do the same thing to our government. And of course, this mentality is the same when it comes to how they impose their views on other countries. And it's very, very similar. Pedro Castillo of Peru, who was just elected as president, he's not 100% there on the LGBTQ issues personally, but he's going to govern depending on what the people want. So a lot of the left will, wag their finger and say, well, that's not good enough. We need everybody to be on the same page. And it's like, that's not how things work. And so that makes sense, actually, the way you're talking about this. So
but isn't it funny that the United States asks other governments or other countries to reform or to impose certain reforms only in countries that it doesn't like, but
Right.
in the allied countries, for example, in the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, or in Kuwait, or in other, these are just the family ruled countries. Do they ask them to do reforms? No.
Yeah.
Only countries that oppose their foreign policy.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia, that's a great example. I mean, how they treat people there. I mean, it's um so the elections, right? I'm a huge advocate of election reform, or completely redoing our elections here in America. I've studied how elections are abroad as well. One of the things that people really, even people who are like hands off Syria, they're like, there's no way that Assad gets this much support from people. The elections must be unfair. Can you talk about how the elections are in Syria, and in terms of, you know, how people go out there and vote and what the support is for the current government?
First of all, I'm not a constitutional expert, but I will try to simplify this. In Syria, you can submit your candidacy in the Syrian People's Assembly, and you need to get 35 votes of 260 MPs. And we have over 70 independent MPs in the parliament, and over 7 or 8 political parties. Okay, so it's very easy to get 35 yes votes from the parliament in Syria, and there were over 50 candidates. Okay, so these names of the candidates, they go to the higher constitutional court, and in the higher constitutional court they study the files and they filter them, and only 3 people remains. So one of the candidates, if I'm not mistaken, his name was Ahmed Marai. So he was from the domestic opposition of Syria, who participated in the Geneva talks sponsored by the UN. So he is a UN approved Syrian opposition who participates in the Geneva talks against the Syrian government. So there is the domestic Syrian opposition in Syria, but the media always sheds lights on the people who live in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, in France, in the United States, and they sell them like an opposition. I'm really sorry, but who are these people? I've never heard of them before 2011, and all of a sudden they became opposition figures, right? So these 3 candidates, they participated in the elections, and Assad got around 95% of the voters, not of the entire people in Syria. There is a misconception, like I think around 14 million people participated in the elections or something. So of these numbers, I'm not really sure, don't quote me, but I have to check the numbers. But of the numbers of the people who participated, he got 95%. And it's very logical number. Let me explain. The Assad has a very big popular base in Syria, which has been ignored for the past 11 years. A lot of people who went to the streets to vote for Assad, maybe they dislike some of his policies, but they wanted to send a message to the outside world. They went to the streets to say, this is our country, we choose who is our president, and it's not your job to tell us. And after 10 years of war, destruction, and sanctions, the sentiments, let's say anti-Western sentiments, especially against the governments, not the people, is very high. And it was very easy for Assad to use that card during the elections. And he was the guy who won this war. So he was the guy who protected his people from this threat, right? So his popularity was growing during the past period. But because of the last 2-3 years, Trump imposed very harsh sanctions on Syria. The people started to suffocate. And because of that suffocation, some people started to have negative sentiments towards the government, because the government is no more able to secure some of the basic needs. But it's not like the government has these basic needs and it's not giving to the people. No, they don't have it. The United States is occupying 50% of Syria's gas and energy resources, and it's occupying the entire wheat of Syria. So when the government cannot really provide these basic necessities, it's the blame, of course, people will blame the government, because they will not go to the Caesar Act and open which article is sanctioning who and what. They will blame the government. So I thought that in 2021, the people will not go like this in millions. And I was surprised to see like millions of people, like waves of people are walking. And I've seen that in Lebanon in 2014. When the elections happened there, it took me 5 hours to walk from Beirut to the embassy, because tens of thousands of people were walking to the polling center, which is the embassy in Syria. And please, some people say in Syria they were forced to go to the. This is utter bullshit. I'm sorry, but even if it's true, what forces? How can you force the people to vote in Lebanon and go to the embassy and vote with tens of thousands? How can you force them to vote in France? How can you force them to vote in Russia or in any other country that allowed the Syrians to go for voting? And the question remains, why Canada banned the Syrians from voting in the Syrian embassy? Why Germany banned Syrians from going to the embassy and voting? I live in Germany and I was deprived of my constitutional right to vote. Why? Because in the past 10 years, they were day and night telling the people that Syrians hate Assad and they fled the country and they became refugees because of him. And all of a sudden, if they let the people vote, they will see like thousands of people going to the embassy to vote. And the people will raise some questions, right? So if they hate Assad, what are they doing? If they don't hate Assad, sorry, what are they doing here? You told us they're refugees because of Assad. So just to save their faces, and they banned these elections. So I am now following this case because I have heard a lot of people talking about this, that the numbers are illogical and everything. And I am collecting the data now from Syria, from the true source and from the Ministry of Justice in Syria, where every polling center, we know how many people have participated in the voting and how many voted for this and how many people voted for the other candidates. These numbers, you cannot fake them, right? Because they are cards for the voting. So we will find the numbers.
Paper ballots?
There is a paper, and there are 3 pictures and names, and you can put just how do we say, like a thumbs up or something over it.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So we will follow. Okay. So there were some. I will mention this because there was a video that I watched on Twitter, and I saw 2 people wearing a military uniform that we don't know who are these people, and they were faking the elections. And I saw that video. Okay. But first of all, we don't know who are these people. And it's very easy to dress a military costume in Syria and fake something like this. And even if it was true, it was genuine, how do we know that these votes were counted or not? And because there were tens of thousands of votes that they were dismissed because of the wrong voting. Because some people, I will also mention this, some people voted with blood. Okay, they bring something that they injured themselves from here, and they like their fingerprint on the name of Assad with their blood. So they say, with our blood we vote for you. I'm sorry, but I don't like that tradition at all. But some people did it, and all their votes were discounted. The government refused to count this. They said, just a pen, guys, and just put your choice. So
wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, but just keep us posted on what you find, because that's one thing that everybody is like, there's no way. And again, it's once again goes back to how Americans try to compare another country's election, which is completely different, to their own. And they're not one to talk because we have completely disastrous election system here. So it's kind of funny. Right now, how do you see the situation in Syria, specifically in terms of U.S. Syrian relationships with the Biden administration as compared to the Trump administration?
Okay. So first of all, the differences are not big, but Biden, it's pretty obvious that he has way more important files to handle. Okay. So it seems, and this is not like 100% information, but because I'm following the negotiations between Russia and the United States regarding Syria, the United States doesn't, like, they know they lost this regime change war, and their presence in Syria is, what are they doing in Syria? They're just stealing $50 million worth of barrel of oil. that's not a strategic goal for staying in Syria. Their stay could cost more than that, right? So they have nothing left in Syria. They're just trying to like stop the reconstruction a year or two or three. But then what? Like the United States has to have a strategy, right? They don't have a strategy now. So at the end, it seems that Biden wanna also focus on China, want to focus more on Russia and bigger issues. So I remember during the days of Obama was complaining like, why do I have to read every day about Syria? We have more important things to do. But when Trump came, Trump was like a very, very pro-Zionism. And because of that, he wanted to punish Iran, which is present in Syria again. So he was waging a proxy war against Iran on Syrian territories. But Biden, and I'm not giving him any credit for that, because just because he has better or more important things to do, and because they failed in Syria, and because the regional countries, except for Turkey, they want to reopen their ties, their diplomatic relations with Syria. The Jordanian king a few days ago, like, it's enough is enough. He said it. They want to continue their relations with Syria. It's been 11 years, and Syria is a strategy. It has a strategic position that they can do trade through Syria to Turkey, to Europe, and from the other way around. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are the same. So now we have a position where Emirates has opened its embassy, Jordan has opened its embassy, Bahrain opened its embassy, Oman opened its embassy. Saudi Arabia will follow suit. At the end, they will all open their embassies in Syria, and the United States will accept this new reality that they lost this war, and they couldn't do it like in Libya. This was the example of Libya. They couldn't repeat it in Syria. It could have worked if it happened in 1 year, 2 years maximum, but 11 years, then what? So what will happen next is hopefully negotiations between Russia and the United States for a face-saving withdrawal of the American forces in the next 2 years, and for Syria to recapture the territories. But we need to also address other security issues such as Idlib, which is the largest safe haven for Al-Qaeda terrorists in the entire world, with like over 10,000 multinational jihadists are there, including 5,000 from Uyghur community fighters, only fighters, 5,000. So it's an international crisis. It's not only our issue now. You know, why would Syrians care about a Chechen terrorist or Uyghur terrorist or anyone from Central Asia or Saudi Arabia? This is also their country's issue. They should take them back. And first of all, they should let Syria capture Idlib and push these terrorists to the borders with Turkey, and then take them to their countries. This is not our issue anymore. And so militarily speaking, it's over. Syria has won this war militarily, but economically speaking, it's still the Western governments are suffocating the Syrian people through the sanctions, and they're punishing any company that wants to deal with Syria. So first they want to compromise with Syria, they want to strike a deal, and then they may allow companies to launch any reconstruction project. But rest assured that if Assad stays in power, he will not let any Western government to invest in Syria. After all they did in Syria, they will not be welcomed here. The share will be for the allies of Syria.
And in terms of Israel, because Israel has been bombing Syria so often that people just stopped even mentioning it here in the West. The US empowers Israel. Biden just gave billions to Israel. Even though he isn't as openly Zionist, he did say once, if we didn't have an Israel, we would have to create one. So yes, he's a Zionist just as bad. He's just not as Trump was more upfront about everything. Biden tries to play the fox with a smile. Israel has tremendous power, and the US continues empowering them with funds and weapons. How does this end for countries in West Asia, particularly, of course, Syria?
I mean, Israel is a country that is based on foreign aid, and if the foreign aid stops, Israel won't survive. And I'm not saying that the surrounding countries will attack Israel. I'm just saying that the pillars of the Israeli existence is based on foreign funding, foreign military support, and all the aid that comes also from the taxpayers of the Americans and non-Americans. So this will continue. It's not like Biden, Trump. It's just the faces will go, and the Zionist lobby is too strong in the United States for any president to go against Israel. So everyone will support Israel. But in the Syrian case, it has become a very ridiculous. Every time a cargo comes from Iran to Syria, because Iran sends weapons to Syria to fight against the terrorists or ammunition, Israel follows all these cargos. Okay, they fly their spying planes like 5, 6, 7 days, and they're watching where these cargos are going, and then they hit these cargos when they arrive to their destination. And they say we're hitting Iranian-backed militias. It's an utter BS. Sometimes they are like Iranian-backed forces in Syria, but all of them are advisors. What they are hitting really is Syrian army forces. There's Syrian soldiers who are dying, not Iranian soldiers or Iranian-backed militias. But in 2018, the Syrian army gunned down an Israeli F-16. So over Syrian airspace, and since then Israel is not flying over Syrian airspace. They're shooting from the skies of Lebanon, or shooting from the occupied Golan Heights, or shooting from the regional waters. So they don't breach the Syrian sovereign airspace, so that they avoid this, right? And unfortunately, the Syrian air defense systems, especially the S-200 and Panzer S-1, they are outdated air defenses. And the newer one that Russia supplied Syria, the S-300, Russia still is hesitant in allowing Syria to use that S-300. Russia doesn't want escalation in the Middle East. They want to de-escalate the situation. But the truth of the matter is, this weapon is a deterrent weapon. And if Israel knows that Syria will use this weapon, they will stop bombing Syria, right? And because their warplanes will be gunned down. So I just read an article 2 days ago, and also Benjamin Netanyahu, the former prime minister, was saying, he seconded this article, saying that it seems that Putin told the new prime minister, I don't even know his name now, remember his name, Yair or something, that they will give a green light to Syria to use the newer air defenses. So let's see how things will develop. Unfortunately, Israel occupies the Golan Heights since '67. And they're not intending to give it back at all. They are trying to build as much as settlements there, and to grab more lands and kick out the indigenous people, just like they do in the Palestinian occupied territories, right? Israel doesn't have any will for peace. Like in Arabic, there's a cartoon I was watching the other day. Israel doesn't want peace. They want this piece of land, and this piece of land, and this piece of land, and we can't really coexist with such a country that is very rogue, and it's based on occupation, based on ethnic cleansing, and based on ethnic segregation, and all this racism, and all these so-called woke people who are anti-racist, and they claim to be anti-racist, but when it comes to Israel, they don't have the balls to say that, to criticize Israel in this regard. And even I live in Germany now. I can't even go on a German TV and say what I say. They will just cut the broadcast and kick me out a second later.
Say you're anti-Semitic. Yeah.
It's funny when they accuse an Arabic people of being anti-Semitic, because a lot of Arabs are also Semites.
Yeah. That always gets lost in translation. Well, thank you for coming on and for being here and debunking a lot of these lies, and clearing some things up, because I think so much just gets repeated and there's no opposition to it. Is there anything else you'd like to let people know? And also let us know where we can find you and find your work.
First of all, I would like to tell your audience that to engage with Syrians, to talk to them, even if they are with or against Assad. Don't have prejudgments. Don't judge on someone who is like he says he's with Assad because in the media they call him like a dictator or the Hitler of 21st century. Engage with them, understand their arguments, and know what are they talking about, because they know their country more than any other pundit or any other journalist. So be active, don't be passive. And especially on social media, it became so poisonous. Like people just call each other names and smear each other, and it's not constructive at all, not for us and not for you. So we in Syria, we love the American people who come to Syria, and we welcome them with open hearts, and we don't have any enmity against the United States. You are guys 10,000 kilometers away from us. If you leave us alone, we have no negative sentiments, right? And for those who want to follow my work, my YouTube channel is Syriana Analysis, and I'm on all the social media platforms from YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook and Instagram. My personal account is also Kevork Almassian. Just it's written on the title here on Zoom. They can follow it, or maybe you can put the links in the description below later.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.